Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide. A reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that President Harold B. Lee's birthday is the same day as President Spencer W. Kimball's, but 4 years later? Discover that President Lee served as a prophet for only 17 months and 19 days. Learn that as a child, Harold's mother drove him and his siblings 2 miles each day to school in a small pony cart, and that he earned his teaching certificate when he was 17 years old, and when he was 18 years old, he became the principal of the Oxford School.
So imagine for a second handing the reins of a massive 3.2 million person global organization to someone whose foundational leadership training basically consisted of shivering in a pony cart.
Right, at like 5 o'clock in the morning.
Exactly. 5 in the morning on a freezing dirt road in rural Idaho. I mean, no elite preparatory academies, no corporate fast-track programs, just a boy traversing 2 miles of harsh landscape to reach a one-room schoolhouse.
It creates this really striking cognitive dissonance, when you map that extremely humble beginning onto his eventual reality. Because we typically assume that the scale of a leader's early environment directly predicts the scale of their future influence.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive into the historical records is so compelling. We are examining the life of Harold B. Lee. He was the 11th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And our mission today is to really extract the mechanics of extreme preparation from the source material we've gathered.
Yeah, we're looking at how that raw childhood grit, surviving these crazy near-fatal frontier accidents, and actually wielding administrative authority before he even finished traditional schooling, how all of that forged a leader capable of engineering massive welfare logistics.
Right in the absolute bottom of the Great Depression. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the notes and historical records provided for this deep dive really offer a masterclass in how daily habits prepare ordinary people for extraordinary tasks. We're looking at the disciplines cultivated entirely out of the public eye.
Yeah, and we have to start with that foundational environment. So Harold B. Lee is born on March 28, 1899, in Clifton, Idaho. His parents are Samuel Marion Lee and Louisa Emily Bingham Lee. And the documentation of their daily farm life describes a physical reality that, honestly, it kind of defies modern comprehension.
It really does. I mean, Harold noted that their chores began well before daybreak.
Yeah.
And that was just so the family could be in position to officially start the actual day's labor when the sun finally came up.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. That procedural detail is crucial, though. The pre-dawn chores weren't the actual work. They were just the requisite maintenance you had to do to simply access the work.
Right, like prepping the tools before the shift even starts.
Exactly. When you're operating in an agrarian environment at the turn of the 20th century, survival is entirely contingent on your output. You don't just work until a scheduled quitting time. You work until the biological and physical demands of the farm are met.
And those demands definitely did not care about sunlight. Because when the sun went down, they were back out doing evening chores by the light of a lantern.
Right.
The psychological conditioning of that is just fascinating to consider. You're effectively decoupling your effort from external cues like the time of day or whether it's light out and attaching your effort purely to task completion.
What's fascinating here is how that lantern light labor builds an automated resistance to procrastination.
Oh, totally.
It forces this cognitive shift where the baseline expectation is just relentless execution. But it's also important to note that this wasn't just, mindless grinding physical exertion.
Right. His father, Samuel, who was serving as the bishop, engineered a very deliberate structure around that labor.
Exactly. Sundays were fiercely protected. So you have this brutal physical reality, but it is entirely wrapped within a highly organized spiritual and communal framework.
And the sources show they actively cultivated intellectual and artistic pursuits alongside the farming, too. Like Harold learned to play the piano.
Right, in a house with 6 kids.
Yeah, a close-knit family of 6 children.
Yeah.
And looking back on the totality of that environment, he later summarized his childhood with a phrase that I think completely redefines the concept of resources. He said, "We had everything money could not buy."
That single sentence essentially maps his entire future leadership philosophy.
Oh, absolutely.
He recognized early on that financial capital is really just one form of leverage, and often a fragile one. They lacked cash, but they possessed immense reserves of character capital, social cohesion, and spiritual discipline.
And that character capital was stress tested constantly. Because the frontier wasn't just exhausting. It was lethal.
Oh, incredibly dangerous.
His mother, Louisa, factors into the historical record not just as a caregiver, but honestly as a literal first responder. She saved his life twice through incredibly rapid, high-stakes decision-making.
The accounts of those incidents read like case studies in crisis management. I mean, they're intense.
It's so intense. So in the first incident, young Harold accidentally pulls a vat of boiling lye down onto himself.
Oh, wow.
And the chemical reality of lye is horrific. It eats through tissue instantaneously. But Louisa doesn't freeze. She doesn't have time to seek outside help or run to a doctor. She immediately turns to a nearby vat of pickled beets, kicks the lid off, and aggressively scoops the red vinegar juice over his entire body.
Which neutralizes the caustic base of the lye with the acid of the vinegar.
Exactly. It's like a makeshift frontier emergency room. She executed a perfect chemical neutralization under blinding panic.
And she followed that exact same pattern of immediate localized resourcefulness a few years later. Harold is working out in the fields and gashes an artery on a broken bottle.
Right.
He is actively bleeding out, far from any kind of medical intervention.
And again, Louisa completely bypasses panic. She grabs ashes from the fire and rubs them directly into the spurting arterial wound to act as a coagulant.
Yeah, stopping the bleeding long enough for the wound to eventually heal.
When you look at these two events side by side, it really reframes his upbringing. He wasn't just learning how to plant crops. He was being conditioned to understand that catastrophic failure can be averted if you act decisively with the resources immediately at hand.
And it also embedded a deep theological certainty within him. These weren't just lucky medical saves. In his framework, these were undeniable instances of divine protection.
Right. He grew up with empirical evidence that the Holy Ghost could and would prompt life-saving action right in the middle of chaos.
Exactly. That certainty became the absolute bedrock of his operational confidence later in life.
Which perfectly prompts a look at how that operational confidence manifested as he moved into adulthood. If surviving the farm built the engine, the next phase of his life is where we see how fast that engine could accelerate.
Yeah, the timeline here is pretty staggering.
It is. He earns a teaching certificate at the age of 17. He begins teaching at the one-room Silver Star School. And then, at 18 years old, he is promoted to become the principal of the Oxford School.
The velocity of that professional advancement is highly unusual, even for that era.
Wait, how does an 18-year-old effectively command a school as principal? I have to challenge the mechanics of this timeline a bit.
I get it, yeah.
Because having a lantern-light work ethic explains his personal productivity, sure. But it doesn't explain how someone barely out of childhood physically wields administrative authority. How do you command the deference of older teachers, angry parents, and local community leaders at 18? Authority at that level usually requires the leverage of age or, extensive credentials.
Well, in a modern, highly credentialed bureaucracy, yes, absolutely. But if we look at the sociology of early 20th century agrarian communities, authority was granted based on visible capability, not age.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the community had already watched him manage adult-level responsibilities on the farm for years. If a young man can coordinate a multi-acre harvest, manage the logistics of livestock, and survive the physical rigors of that environment, the community views him as an adult. He basically bypassed adolescent frivolity because the environment simply didn't allow for it.
So the authority was granted because he had already demonstrated the output of an adult.
Precisely. And the historical records actually use a specific repeating phrase to describe his trajectory. They say, one assignment followed another. It's the mechanics of compounding trust. He executed flawlessly in a one-room schoolhouse, proving he could manage curriculum and discipline. The community leaders recognized that competence and immediately scaled his responsibility up to the Oxford School.
That makes total sense. It wasn't about his age on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
It was about his proven capacity for execution.
Exactly.
So he stays in education for 4 years before transitioning to serve a mission, the Western States Mission. And this period is also pivotal personally because he meets Fern L. Tanner, who is serving in the same mission. They eventually marry on November 4th, 1923 in the Salt Lake Temple and build a family.
Right. They had 2 daughters. So by his early 20s, the foundational architecture is fully in place. You have a man with a relentless capacity for labor, proven administrative competence, deep theological grounding, and a stable family unit.
Yeah.
And all of this localized preparation is about to intersect with a massive macroeconomic disaster.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because leading a school in rural Idaho requires localized problem solving, right?
Yeah.
But in 1930, Harold B. Lee is called to be a stake president.
At age 31.
31 years old, making him the youngest stake president in the church at that time. And the year 1930 means he is stepping into this leadership role precisely as the Great Depression is vaporizing the national economy.
The magnitude of the crisis he faced really cannot be overstated. He wasn't dealing with a slight economic downturn. He was looking at systemic collapse.
Yeah.
People in his geographic stewardship were losing their life savings, their homes, their ability to feed their families.
And there was no pre-existing federal safety net to catch them. He is suddenly tasked with the physical survival of thousands of people. So he is asked to pilot a brand new church welfare program. He eventually becomes the first managing director and chairman of the Church Welfare Committee.
Right.
But I want to dig into the how here. It's like being the CEO of a massive crisis response startup. How does a 31-year-old actually build a localized economic safety net from scratch when the broader economy has completely seized up?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see him utilizing the exact same logic his mother used with the beet juice and the ashes.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He looked at the immediate resources available, no matter how unconventional they were, and combined them to neutralize the crisis. He realized that while financial capital had vanished, human capital and physical materials still existed.
Yeah, he effectively built a closed-loop supply chain. Instead of treating the crisis as a purely charitable problem which just depletes centralized funds quickly, he treated it as a logistical matching problem.
Exactly the right framework. He had congregations full of unemployed laborers who had time and energy but no food.
Right.
And he had access to agricultural areas where farmers had surplus crops literally rotting in the fields because no one had the cash to buy them.
So he connects the two. He organizes the unemployed laborers to harvest the surplus crops. The labor becomes the currency. They process and store the food in regional storehouses, creating this parallel microeconomy based on mutual aid rather than scarce cash. I mean, it is brilliant.
And it was psychologically brilliant as well. By organizing it this way, he preserved the dignity of the individuals involved. They weren't receiving handouts. They were actively working to sustain themselves and their neighbors.
Yeah.
It traces directly back to his childhood realization. We had everything money could not buy. He knew how to build wealth and stability without relying on a bank account.
He took the extreme poverty of his youth, paired it with his administrative background as a principal, and scaled it to save thousands from ruin. The logistics of those early storehouses and work projects laid the blueprint for a welfare system that operates globally today.
It's incredible.
And it's that exact capacity for execution that accelerates him to the highest echelons of church leadership. Because on April 6, 1941, President Heber J. Grant calls him to be an apostle.
Which initiates a massive shift in scale. He spends the next 3 decades traveling, teaching, and refining the organizational structure of the church across the globe.
3 decades of high-level, grueling administrative and spiritual leadership. Which brings us to July 10, 1972. Following the passing of President Joseph Fielding Smith, Harold B. Lee becomes the president of the church. He is the prophet, holding the ultimate mantle of leadership for 3.2 million members.
And when he steps into that role, his core directive to the membership is remarkably distilled. He doesn't roll out complex new organizational theories. His primary message was simple. He said, "The safety of the church lies in the members keeping the commandments. There is nothing more important that I could say. As they keep the commandments, blessings will come."
It's the ultimate reduction to the essentials. But this is where the historical timeline presents a staggering paradox. We've just tracked over 70 years of relentless, compounding preparation. The pony cart, the chemical burns, the teenage administration, the Great Depression logistics, the decades as an apostle. You look at that trajectory and you expect a presidency that spans decades, right? A long epoch of leadership.
Naturally, yes.
But Harold B. Lee served as the prophet for only 17 months and 19 days.
It is a profound constraint. He passed away on December 26, 1973, at the age of 74.
Less than a year and a half. How does someone spend 73 years preparing for an assignment that lasts 17 months? I mean, it completely disrupts our modern calculus of success, where we assume the value of a role is tied to how long we hold the title.
This raises an important question about the nature of legacy. President Spencer W. Kimball, who succeeded President Lee and who, interestingly, was born on the exact same day, March 28th, just 4 years prior, spoke at his funeral.
Oh.
And the summary President Kimball provided perfectly encapsulates the density of those 17 months. He said, "A giant of a man he was, a giant whose shadow fell across the world, bringing under it the influence of the gospel to millions of members and friends of the church."
a giant whose shadow fell across the world. That implies that the impact wasn't generated by the length of the presidency, but by the sheer mass of the man occupying the office.
That is the crucial insight here. A shallow leader might need 20 years to effect meaningful change, but someone who has spent 7 decades executing every single assignment with the intensity of a lantern-lit harvest, they don't need 20 years.
Wow.
The preparation itself creates a density of character that makes even a brief tenure historically massive.
So what does this all mean? If we distill the entirety of Harold Lee's life from these source materials, the through line is the unseen mechanics of extreme readiness.
Exactly.
He didn't know the lie was going to spill. He didn't know the Great Depression was going to hit precisely as he became a state president. He certainly didn't know his time as prophet would be limited to just 17 months.
Right. He couldn't have foreseen any of that.
He simply treated the task immediately in front of him, whether it was feeding pigs in the dark or building a global supply chain as the most critical assignment of his life.
He built the capacity to respond to the Holy Ghost in the mundane, everyday things, which meant he was already primed to respond when the stakes became global.
Which completely flips the mirror back onto us.
Yeah.
I mean, think about your own early jobs or the challenges you're facing right now. If you are listening to this and you find yourself in a season of life that feels obscure, grueling, or, super localized, oh, look good. Maybe you are doing the modern equivalent of chopping wood by lantern light. Lee's life is the ultimate proof of concept that none of that effort is wasted.
Yeah, it is actively constructing your capacity to bear weight later on. The required infrastructure for major impact is almost always built in the dark, completely without an audience.
And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. We naturally assume that we are preparing for a long, sustained marathon on the mountaintop. We think our ultimate contribution requires decades of visibility actually matter.
Right.
But what if the defining mission of your life, the specific moment you are uniquely forged to handle, only lasts 17 months? Are you executing your daily responsibilities with enough intensity and cultivating enough spiritual precision that even a brief window on your highest stage would allow you to cast a shadow across the world? Think about that as you go through your day. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep doing the work in the dark. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you for joining us for this day in His story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in His story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.